Good morning, everybody. Well, today is a day full of input, so I'm kind of lucky to have drawn the first number, so I hope you're still alive and kicking. What I'll do this next, 45 minutes, I hope it don't get longer, is to talk about what I call a genealogy of participatory culture. So it will not be that much about participation in the museum. I leave this to Leontine, who will talk in the next session, and specific case studies by Gabor and the Budapest group and by Safinas. So what I thought might be interesting for you and for us together would be to look at this term of participatory culture, which has become quite a buzzword and could have been on this sketch that class presented us yesterday. Of course, I hope that you will find some of my thoughts worthy of transferring to what we're actually doing here and what we're trying to find out with this topic, participation in and the museum. As almost always in the beginning with me, there was this title. I somehow liked the title of sketching a genealogy of participatory culture, hoping by this to get into a more substantial understanding of what participation or participatory culture is, how many is it, and working on the lecture, of course, it became more and more confusing. So what I present today is definitely a sketch. It is a draft for things to come. The good thing about this, it's very fresh. I actually never talked about the prosumer, the likers, or the liker and the do-it-yourselfer. So also for me this is the first time in a more conceptual way of thinking about those figures that I want to present to you. Yeah, you're wooing. I'm looking forward to hear about my mistakes.
First-timers, it's interesting.
It became confusing, I said, because participatory culture is deeply interdisciplinary, and so are its roots. Thinking and reading my way into the topic, it became clear quite fast that participatory culture is about a new relationship between producers and consumers. This is what I focus on this lecture. I will focus on what I call the blurring between the position, the traditional role and position of the consumer and the producer. But realizing that, I thought, or I realized that the story of 60s and 70s art actually is relevant for this relationship and its transgression. You know, to transgress this traditional border of here we do have the producer, here we have the consumer as well. Why that? Because, as most of you will know, and very briefly, happening and performance art of this time and since this time focused on the role of the viewer, making him and her a participant in the process of producing and reviewing art. So why not then start with John Cage or Nam Yuen Paik when dealing with participatory culture, new music, new media art. The more those artists and those aesthetics played with contingency, with randomness and with a substantial disorder, the more they call upon the viewer to somehow, in some ways, finish this work of art in a process of co-production. So the viewer is meant to somehow, if not finish, then at least process further on the process that the artists have started. If then participatory culture is about the blurring of the roles of producers and consumers, then contemporary art from the 16th onwards has definitely an important role to play. And even though I guess most all of you know 4 minutes 33 seconds from John Cage, I will show just very briefly 1 minute. It was replayed 2010 now again in the Royal Albert Hall in London, and there was a whole evening about it. It was in German television as well, I think in most of European television. And what I found interesting was actually the role of the television commentator introducing this play, where nothing happens and a lot happens. So watch him and listen what he says, because somehow he is a museum pedagogue. Okay, listen to him. Yeah. Okay. But we'll have the time, even though there's. Let's see. No.
So you got some info thing that you hit down.
Cage wrote 4 minutes 33 as a piece in 3 movements where the performer does absolutely nothing, allowing the audience to absorb the sounds around them. Everyone experiencing the piece in a different way, therefore, because we all hear things in a different way. Tonight the piece is being presented in full orchestral version, conducted by Lawrence Foster. He's going to give a downbeat to each of the 3 movements. He'll turn pages when he needs to, and of course the orchestra will remain silent, we hope, throughout the piece. I reckon Cage would be pretty pleased that this piece is being televised, because of course you at home are going to experience this piece in a very different way to those of us here in the hall. Well, I promise you, this is the piece everyone here tonight has come to experience. There really is nothing like John Cage's 4 minutes, 33 seconds.
Sorry to interrupt this, I know this is very nice. You might have realized that the audience and the performers do actually have the same position. They are sitting, being silent. So already there is a connection. There is a hint of, okay, we are somehow on a same or similar level. So the audience in Royal Albert Hall, quite explicitly in the beginning by the commentator, is asked to fulfill the artwork by listening to it differently, to step in as a co-producer of the artwork, to close the gap that a piece about silence and in silence has opened up. I will definitely come back to these new modes of conceptualizing the role of the consumer, that means viewer and visitor, within contemporary art. However, and with this in mind, I want to turn to Henry Jackson. After all, he is to find guilty in making participatory culture a buzzword by publishing the MIT study Confronting the Challenges of Participatory Culture. So what I found in this study amongst other, is, or what I decided to take out is the following extract, 3 quotes. It is not that much about art to begin with, but as I said, I will come back to that later. First quote. Our focus here is not on individual accomplishment, but rather the emergence of a cultural context that supports widespread participation in the production and distribution of media. So participation, in my own words, is more than an individual everyday practice. Even though, of course, we participate in our everyday and average life every day and everywhere. Of course, we do participation all the time, almost without knowing or reflecting on it. But participatory culture, in this sense, is more than things that individuals do. It is, by definition, a culture. That means it tells us something about our or any given society. Or it should tell us something. Second quote. Not every member must contribute, but all must believe they are free to contribute, and that what they contribute will be appropriately valued. In my words, participatory culture is, moreover, a story about how a society should work. Quite clear, it is future-oriented, or at least one dimension of participatory culture consists in terms of a vision. It imagines a world of inclusiveness and of mutual appreciation. Third quote. Participatory cultures emerging as the culture absorbs and responds to the explosion of new media technologies that make it possible for average consumers to archive, annotate, appropriate, and recirculate media content in powerful new ways. In my own words, participatory culture is, or should be, a way for consumers to become more powerful by becoming more creative. Archive, annotate, appropriate, recirculate. Those are terms from the field of art and curating practices. It is here, the 60s, it is here John Cage comes in again, but in a very specific way, as linkage between the consumer and the artist, or at least the creative spirit. I don't know if you read Jenkins' study, but if you have, you might agree that in parts at least, this is an ideology of participatory culture. I said this before, for me it reads sometimes like an Apple ad. It is, or an Apple slogan, every consumer is its own creative director as long as it has the creative instruments, the creative tools that Apple or Microsoft or whoever supplies us with. So as I don't want to sound like Apple, I'm not telling you what participatory culture is, according to Jenkins anymore, but in the following, but what it's supposed to be. On the most general level, I think, participatory culture is supposed to be a term that makes sense. It is a sense maker of our time. This is why it's called a culture. It makes sense, I would say, because it mingles 3 distinctive contemporary features, or at least I am focusing now on these 3 features. First, participatory culture is supposed to make sense as a kind of subculture. This is to say that participatory culture gives us the impression that some of us use the right tools and know which buttons to press, some of us don't. I will explore this in more detail in just a second by looking at the do-it-yourselfers. Second, participatory culture is supposed to make sense as a common culture for everybody. This is to say that participatory culture gives us the impression of a promise that we have to work for. I will explore this in more detail by looking at the prosumer. Third, participatory culture is supposed to make sense as a new consumer culture. This is to say that participatory culture gives us the impression that it helps us to get away from the old notion of being passively seduced consumer. I will explore this in more detail by looking at the likers. So, in talking about do-it-yourselfers, we could go back all the way to the beginning of the last century, when the slogan "do-it-yourself" was coined in 1912 in an article of the American journal Suburban Life. Ever since then, DIY is a synonym for an amateur culture, for the average man and woman who are doing things without having expertise. But they are gaining expertise in the process of doing, by doing it themselves. Classical fields of the DIY are, as you might know, house and garden. This is where the DIY crossed the Atlantic. In the 60s, countries in Europe saw the introduction of various Home Depot stores. At the same time in Europe, the DIY established also their own communication platforms. Different journals, magazines, covering every single aspect of how to do things by yourself. In Germany, I remember, the most prominent journal was called Selbst ist der Mann. There was actually a journal, Selbst ist die Frau, as well. I haven't found that, so I picked a cover where a woman is in the front, but it's still called Selbst ist der Mann, because it's about refurnishing the kitchen. So, translating this, Selbst ist der Mann, Selbst ist die Frau, would say doing yourself makes the man, makes the woman. Everybody of you is aware that gendering is a topic here. I will not go into this, because what seems to me, at least right now, more important in regard to participatory culture is the fact that I would state DIY has worked out or started out as a subculture. DIY positions itself against a dominant culture of experts, against a dominant culture of mass consumption. It has its own various platforms. Those platforms, the journals of yesterday, the home pages of today, the YouTube channels of today, have a typical subcultural function, which you all know from fanzines. They include and confirm the norms and values of their members. As all subcultures, DIY is about exclusion and inclusion. As far as you exclude yourself from a dominant culture, or you feel excluded, or you actually are excluded, the more it matters that you belong somewhere else. In this respect, do-it-yourselfers are also associated with the political field. In fact, besides Home Depot and gardening, there are groups like the Craftisters, it means critical crafting circles, linking riot girls, feminism, DIY subculture, and crafting. For them, as for many other critical DIY groups, it is important to re-establish a self-determined circle of production. DIY reclaims, in private, but sometimes as a political statement, that everybody can or should be an active producer of material goods. As all subcultures, DIY has ended up, as all other subcultures, so far, as mainstream. Hence, do-it-yourselfers are to be found everywhere, as arty IKEA hackers that reorganize the crappy material from the best-known do-it-yourself store in the world, or as a semi-professional, semi-amateur advisor on YouTube that helps us with virtually everything. From how to turn a one-bedroom apartment into a two-bedroom apartment, and less than 3 minutes, I watched this video, to how to put on your makeup while you are in classes. Those models of today show even more explicit, as the old ones, that DIY is about a process of de- and re-professionalization. First step, deprofessionalization. Everybody should give advice on what they think they are good at. Second step, re-professionalization. There are certain amateurs who are very good at performing to give advice. They find modes and aesthetics to act as the most professional amateur. They fulfill the image of an amateur most professional. However, the IKEA hacker example shows again in which respect do-it-yourselfers are part of the genealogy of participatory culture. They argue, and that means arguing by practically doing it, that our normative ways of consuming goods need more individual crafting, more self-determination, self-awareness, more amateurism. By this, do-it-yourselfers have shown that creative dealings with mass consumption can be turned into a business model. They are both outside and inside the circle of production which they are opposing.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you say amateurs, do you mean without formal education?
Yes.
In something?
Yes.
Because I was a bit confused with
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Without being
education
formally accepted as professionals or somehow having knowledge in the field.
Yeah, so you can actually be very skilled at something. You would still be defined as an amateur.
Yes.
Because you have to have this formally.
This is why, this is why the first step, defining yourself as amateur, as an average, as an everyday people, I just know how to make makeups, or I just do this not for a job, turning one-room bedrooms into two-room bedrooms. I just do this, but I'm very good at it, so I can give advice. And then, second step actually steps in. Turning to the prosumer. Today, you will know this term, or you might know this term, in relation to user-generated content. Thus, I was thrilled of reading parts of Alvin Toffler's book, The Third Wave, from 1980, where he developed the term and the idea of the prosumer for the first time. The user-generated content of today, its actors and its agents, are the prosumers of yesterday. I was thrilled, I said, because I had not expected this kind of visionary language in a book that deals to a great extent with economics. It was as if I was reading the Old Testament. A new civilization is emerging in our lives, and blind men everywhere are trying to suppress it. This new civilization brings with it new family styles, changed ways of working, loving and living, a new economy, new political conflicts, and beyond all this is an altered consciousness as well. What is it that makes Toffler that euphoric? Why is he actually comparing, as he does in his book, the 1980s, the emerging of a prosumer, with the Neolithic Revolution some 10,000 years ago, when mankind started to settle down for the first time? The Third Wave, title of his book, for him has actually the same relevance, the same revolutionary potential as the Neolithic transformation of mankind. What then is the Third Wave? If Wikipedia is right, then Alvin Toffler and his wife have inspired many cyberpunks, as well as important Detroit techno DJs with their books. I didn't know that. What I think to know is that Toffler, far from being a neo-Marxist, actually argues with the help of Marx, with the help of historical materialism. That means simply that he implicitly states that economy is the primary setting when it comes to change society. Toffler's book is not called The Prosumer, it is called The Third Wave. He wants to describe and to influence a society that has to change. But he argues with economy as his first advocate. Das Sein bestimmt das Bewusstsein, as we know it from Karl Marx. This is why I picked the prosumer as an important figure in the context and genealogy of participatory culture. Again, it is the blurring of the role of a passive consumer, visitor, on the one side, and the active producer, participant on the other. It is important to realize that the prosumer, even more explicit as the do-it-yourselfer, is a visionary figure. He is a healer. Prosumers, according to Toffler, could heal an alienated society by overcoming, the quote you read here, the historic breach between producer and consumer, giving rise to the prosumer economies of tomorrow. As all visionaries, Toffler tells the story of mankind again in his book. He goes back to what he calls the first wave in history, when every producer of material goods was a consumer of those same goods, material goods. Production for self-use is the key word within the first wave. There is no breach, no gap between a farmer that produces the food that he is consuming himself. First wave. The second wave is what Toffler calls production for exchange. Not surprisingly, he identifies the process of the Industrial Revolution as the driving force behind the second wave. The producers of goods, the classical worker in the factory, loses sight and loses power over production processes. He gets alienated from the products he produces because he's not consuming them, he's producing them for exchange. Toffler states that the production for exchange, including the growing service and leisure sector of the early 20th century, rises continuously in its relevance and in its power. So, second wave becomes more and more important, whereas the production for self-use is barely visible anymore. Second wave production for exchange. As simple as this may sound, and it is simplistic, it is still full of some relevant observations. Toffler argues that the production for self-use is still amongst us today. In terms of all the unpaid work that is, quote, done by women in the home, all the cleaning, scrubbing, child caring, the community organization. It is unpaid work, first wave, but it is used to sustain second wave production for exchange. With this in mind, so with this breach, first wave, second wave, you can imagine why and how the prosumer should heal not only economy, but society in general. This is why Toffler argues that prosumers are coming back, or that they should come back. In his perspective, prosumers have been made invisible by second wave production. They are hiding or have to hide in the homes, making unpaid work for second wave economy. But now they are in the center of economic action again. This time not as farmers and hunters, but equipped with high-end technology. User-generated content, even though not known in the 80s, or not prominent in the 80s, started here. Hence, in the center of Toffler's figure of the prosumer is the idea of production for self-use. This is the center of his argumentation. In the very moment when somebody is producing something for him or herself, not only individuals, but also as a group, as a small entity, as a family. He and she is acting as prosumer. In Toffler's words, people consume what they themselves produce. This doesn't mean, and this actually is important, I didn't get this at first reading, however, so this doesn't mean that the products they are producing for self-use are limited to prosumers, are limited to themselves. They can be used by others, they can be shared, they can be valued, they can be distributed. But in the center, in the beginning of the production circle, they need to be produced for self-use, not for exchange. This is a tricky thing because quite easily we could argue if you once distributed, then you are in the circle of exchange. So where is this border? You know, where are you kind of allowed in Toffler's terms of them sharing things you in the beginning have produced for yourself? I couldn't quite figure this out. I just wanted to let you know, or you obviously see this as a problem, that production for self-use can be shared and can be distributed to others. I cannot avoid to notice that this definition shows certain parallels to the participating visitor in the museum. Isn't that, so I won't go into it, just as a kind of parallel you might see as well, isn't that what we expect, museum professionals and thinkers, when we approach the visitor or the community? That they find relevant topics for themselves, that they produce content for self-use, for their community, relevant for self-use, for defining themselves, their heritage, their belongings, their dreams. Symbolic context, though, but nevertheless immaterial goods that first and foremost should be defined and produced by the visitor, the communities themselves, and which then can be shared by others. Question? Is some kind of a hybrid figure between the consumer and the producer. It is both important that consumption and production is conceptualized in a classical dichotomy. So here we have the active producer, here we have the passive consumer, and it is important that the discourse is able to imagine exactly the hybrid healer that transgresses the dichotomy of active producer and passive consumer. As I indicated, I see both artists and works of art of the 60s as a discourse of transgression that somehow prepared for the prosumer, couldn't find a better word. I also see the DIY as some sort of facilitator for the prosumer. However, it is important to realize that the prosumer has given way to the culture of participation. Unlike the DIY, the prosumer is conceptualized not as a subculture. Somebody knows, somebody doesn't. But as a whole new civilization, as a coming and ideal culture for everybody. So there is a shift from the DIY, do-it-yourselfer, still working and functioning within the concept of subculture, and the prosumer going out, healing the world, healing civilization, trying to find ways to get on the next level, which is then called the third wave in Toffler's world. Hence, the figure of the prosumer, the idea of prosuming, affects all subsystems of society, not only economies. As it challenges the role and function of an active producer on the one side and a passive audience on the other, it calls upon new modes of participation. Or, to put it differently, prosuming is the act of producing material and immaterial goods that are produced for self-use, but distributed for exchange. While they are produced for self-use, they implicitly ask the viewer to accomplish it, to participate in the process of material or immaterial production. Prosumer goods are goods that need to be processed, that need to be fulfilled. Just a very obvious example, the software product Linux, which you all know, is in this respect a classical example of prosumer culture, even though we call it today user-generated content. It is both the product of a self-determined consumer culture, producing for self-use, that can be shared by others, as it calls out to constantly participate in the process of producing Linux. This is why Toffler's idea of the prosumer is such a holistic approach that aims to change not only economy, but, as I quote in the beginning, changed ways of working, living and living. Seen that way, and following Toffler's arguments, the third wave actually affects everything, as we have to state that material or immaterial goods that are produced by prosumers produce prosumers. Before turning to the liker, finally, I want to give you a brief summary, also for myself, of what participatory culture seems to be and seems to me. If we follow the genealogy of the do-it-yourself and the prosumer, just those two figures, not more. Obviously, I focused on the nexus of participation and economy. However, I started out by talking about art and the idea of art as it was conceptualized in the 60s by John Cage, Namjoon Pike, Yoko Ono, Joseph Beuys, many others. I did this because I claim that the blurring role of the producer and the consumer, which we are discussing, I think, when we are discussing participatory culture, have been heavily influenced by the works of those days. The mind-blowing thesis, which is totally coming today, that the visitor of art takes actively part in the production of an artwork by filling out the gaps that conceptual art, happening art, performance art, new media art was opening up, is a fundamental experience of participation. This experience and this credo helped to transform passive consumers of art into active producers of art. Built on this experience and credo, participatory culture explores in how far the blurring of the relationship between producers and consumers can be further transgressed and exploited. As an aesthetic product, or as aesthetic products that need to be fulfilled or processed, at least not completed, that ask for participatory support. As a business model with its roots in subculture activities. As a constant process between deprofessionalization and reprofessionalization. As a model and vision for a coming society that finds its archetype in the past. So, this is, following Toffler at least, you might see that the prosumer, even though he's a healer for the future, he is looking back all the time. The archetype for the third wave is the first wave, is farming culture. So the prosumer is quite a modern traditionalist. He probably would vote for Die Grünen in Germany. Hence, participatory culture is the calling to make something out of the blurring of the dichotomy of producers and consumers. If this dichotomy, historical, logically, actually exists, is not that important, to be quite honest. So I'm not arguing that we actually have this dichotomy. Here we do have a consumer, all passive and seduced. Here we have the, the productive and active producer. Like in fact, but we have this dichotomy. We have this model of how we conceptualize, how we think consuming culture. And this is important because only by this we can find, figures like the do-it-yourself or the prosumer that transgress, that heal this dichotomy. It's quarter to 11. I have very little to talk about the liker, actually, not only because of time. Maybe I can say that much. I like the liker, even though I don't like myself. I mean, I like myself, but I'm not a liker. So why do I like the liker? Because the liker, as we know him from Facebook, makes one of the most important aspects of culture in general and consuming culture specifically visible, very visible. The call for decision. Culture is not only about participation, process, and constant change. It is also about taking sides. As relevant and as important it is to blur the boundaries, to blur belongings, to blur identity, it is also important to make a decision. Simple as that. Likers perform decisions. Very archetypical decision. Old Testament style decisions. Yes or no. Like it or not. Buy it or not. Visit it or not. But as archetypical as this may sound, a Facebook liker is more than that. Even though the likes go almost with no words, so no reasoning, no explanation why I like this, why I don't like this. It goes with names and faces. Clicking on the likes, everybody knows that. Everybody knows that, so you get to know the liker. Likers tell others what others like. So at the end, it doesn't go without relations anyhow. Nothing more to say. Thank you for your patience.
Woo.
This is actually a project by Natalia Rojas, The Faces of Facebook. So all together 1 Milliarden, 1 Milliarde, 270 million, 2005, 489 faces 2 days ago. So all those pixels you see are the Facebook faces, or at least the faces, the images that you leave on Facebook. And she has developed she calls herself a creative technologist freelance. She has created somehow a program that can, change those or gather in those faces and make them all together to a picture. And this is an ongoing process. If you click on the site today, you will have more faces or less. I don't know if Facebook's still going up and down. I don't know. But this is the faces of Facebook. Okay. I don't know if you're very exhausted, or if you have. We have 10 minutes. We could have 10 minutes for questions and comments before we turn to the next input. This was very, how you call it, dense for me as well, because as I said, I did this for the first time, so I had to concentrate myself on what I want to say. So this is why this came as some sort of,
Okay, so looking for the about how
you don't have any comments, you could easily,
I'm actually wondering, because if he wrote about those if he wrote about those 3 waves in that's 1980, right?
Yeah.
So what comes next? It's only been 30 years
The
in
fourth
theory, so
wave,
we'll expect that now we have a theory of what's going to be next.
No, I think this is why I made the point that even though, of course, this is very broadly a broad argument, but the user-generated content of today is the prosumer of yesterday. So what he calls himself Toffler, futurist, Futurologe. So he was writing for for the years to come, and this is why I found this so interesting, that we have something from the 80s and we have a defined figure, the prosumer, and you find all those journals, of course, today. There are the journals of the prosumer, prosumer culture, but that work very close with this idea of somehow we are digital farmers now. We're producing for self-use. We don't like Apple, we don't like Windows, we don't like whatever. So we establish and we just make Linux. We just make it and we make it together. We do it together and we invite others to do it. And we share this knowledge, and there is somehow a product, but this product is changing all the time and gets better and better. This is definitely prosumer culture, as Toffler would see it. But what was so important for me is that I was so thrilled, as I said, by reading this language, because it's really Old Testament. It is really, there is a new civilization coming. Everything will, be healed. Not asking if this, breach, this gap, first of all, is there at all, if this really is such a black and white construction, or if we want to be healed. If it really needs to be healed in a way, if there is some sort of a third wave, an overall third, it's like the dritte Weg. I don't know if there is an English expression for that. That makes a third way between capitalism and socialism. So it's always this, overcoming a dichotomy that one has to state first. One has to construct this dichotomy for then to find figures to overcome it. And I think this is, of course this is somehow my argument or my linkage, that it is within participation or participatory culture as well. This visionary, we heal society with it. Not everywhere, not dominant all the time, but there is this feeling of, with participation, participatory culture, if it's called user-generated content or going out to the communities, there is this, maybe that's quite okay. I don't judge it. I just say that there is this, fundament. The other fundament is still, I think, the subculture, saying like, oh, somebody knows how to do it, somebody doesn't.
I think you gave us a lot of food for thought. So it's absolutely not because of a lack of interest in ethics, reflecting on myself. It's more like I don't know how you are doing. But
It's very interesting.
We take a 5 minutes break and then start. Thank you very much.
Woo!